Right, so Rachel Reeves goes on BBC Breakfast for her first big interview of 2026, and within minutes, the entire nation's collectively screaming at their telly like it's a penalty shootout, and the rest just bottled it. Absolute scenes on Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it this week, with viewers fuming that the interview was softer than a marshmallow in a hot tub. Some reckon the host went easy on her, others reckon they talked over her too much, and a few brave souls pointed out that maybe, just maybe, the Chancellor herself wasn't exactly nailing her lines. It's political theater at its finest, folks, and spoiler alert, nobody's happy. So buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into the chaos that was Rachel Reeves versus BBC Breakfast versus the entire viewing public. And honestly, it's messier than a student flat on a Sunday morning. Let's start with the viewers, shall we? Because honestly, the reaction on social media was more divided than a Brexit dinner table. You had one camp absolutely livid that Sally Nugent and John Kay were apparently lobbing softballs at the Chancellor like they're hosting a gentle game of rounders in the park. One viewer absolutely lost it, branding the interview appalling and tone-deaf, claiming Reeves only showed up because she knew she'd get an easy ride. Brutal. Another poor soul lamented the absence of Andrew Neil, because let's be honest, if you want a politician properly grilled, you call in the heavy artillery. They literally called the BBC Breakfast hosts useless mules, which is a bit harsh but also quite funny if we're being real. Then you've got the folks who reckon the interview was wasted because the presenters didn't stop Reeves when she went off on one of those classic political tangents where they answer a completely different question to the one you've asked. You know the move. It's Politics 101. Avoid, deflect, repeat a meaningless soundbite, job done. But here's where it gets properly entertaining. Just when you think everyone's united in slamming the hosts, another faction emerges from the digital trenches, arguing the complete opposite. One viewer complained that the presenters were talking over Reeves too much, not letting her get a word in edgeways. So now we've got people saying the hosts were too soft and simultaneously too aggressive. Classic British public that. Can't agree on anything. One person watched the whole thing and declared it one of the most painful things I've ever had to watch, which feels a bit dramatic, but also fair enough. We've all sat through political interviews that made us question our life choices. And then, plot twist, someone actually blamed Reeves herself, pointing out that most of her answers consisted of and ah, suggesting she's not exactly a wordsmith and maybe shouldn't be crunching the nation's numbers if she can't string a sentence together without stumbling. Ouch. That's the kind of observation that stings because it's got a grain of truth wrapped in a blanket of savage. Now, let's talk about what actually happened in the interview, because amidst all the drama about who did what wrong, there was actual political substance buried in there. Rachel Reeves got grilled, or gently toasted, depending on which angry tweeter you believe, about Labour's frankly staggering collection of U-turns. We're talking a government that's changed direction more times than a GPS with a dodgy signal. Sally Nugent came out swinging with a list longer than your Tesco receipt at Christmas. Digital IDs, the two-child benefit cap, grooming gangs inquiry, the island of strangers comments, welfare reform, winter fuel payments, farmers and inheritance tax, pub business rates. It's like a greatest hits album of policy reversals. Nugent basically asked a question we're all thinking. Why do you lot keep changing your minds? It's a fair point. When a government does more backflips than an Olympic gymnast, people start wondering if there's actually a plan or if they're just making it up as they go along. Reeves's response to this barrage was, well, let's say diplomatic. She insisted the government was pretty relaxed about digital ID requirements, which is a fascinating choice of words when your boss has literally stood at a lectern weeks earlier declaring this policy absolutely essential and non-negotiable. She tried to frame it as not really a U-turn, more of a slight adjustment, a minor tweak, nothing to see here. The argument was basically that people still need digital ID to prove their right to work, but maybe it doesn't have to be one specific type of digital ID. Maybe it could be an e-visa or an e-passport instead. And honestly, who cares about the details? Which, is one way to handle it. It's not a U-turn if we just redefine what we meant in the first place approach. Classic stuff. But then John K jumped in with the kind of follow-up that makes political communications teams break out in a cold sweat. He pointed out that the Prime Minister wasn't looking very relaxed when he stood at that lectern banging on about how important this specific digital ID was going to be. It's the journalistic equivalent of, sorry, but your homework doesn't match what you said in class. Kay essentially called out the massive gap between what Keir Starmer said a few weeks ago and what Reeves was now trying to sell as totally consistent policy. Because here's the thing, you can't have your Prime Minister doing the whole stern, serious, this is crucial for national security and border control routine, and then have your Chancellor rock up saying, yeah, we're pretty chill about it actually, whatever works. That's not messaging discipline, that's messaging chaos. When pressed on how all these U-turns make the government look, Reeves wheeled out another classic political defense. Most people don't actually care about the specifics. Her line was essentially that regular folks aren't bothered whether it's one particular type of digital ID or just some form of digital verification. What matters is solving the problem. Which, again, is a reasonable argument on the surface, but it dodges the actual question. The question wasn't whether people care about the granular policy details. The question was why this government keeps announcing policies with grand fanfare, insisting they're absolutely vital, and then quietly rowing back when the backlash hits. It's the pattern that's the problem, not the individual policy tweaks. And this is where Labor's really starting to struggle. When you come into government promising competence and stability after years of conservative chaos, you can't then spend your first year and a half doing an impression of a government that doesn't quite know what it's doing. Every U-turn chips away at that core brand promise. Winter fuel payments? Announced, then partially reversed amid fury from pensioners and charities. Inheritance tax on farms? Rolled out, then watered down after farmers descended on Westminster with tractors. The two-child benefit cap? Still in place despite enormous pressure from Labor's own backbenchers. The grooming gangs inquiry? Initially resisted, then announced after relentless criticism. It's not that any individual policy shift is necessarily wrong. Sometimes governments should listen and adapt. But the cumulative effect is a government that looks reactive rather than strategic, driven by headlines rather than conviction. What's particularly fascinating about the BBC Breakfast Meltdown is that it reveals something deeper about political communication in 2026. We're in this bizarre situation where viewers simultaneously demand tough questioning and complain when politicians get interrupted. They want substantive answers but lose patience when those answers involve nuance or caveats. They slam journalists for being too soft and then accuse them of talking over guests. It's an impossible balancing act, and honestly, breakfast television was never designed to be Newsnight. Sally Nugent and John K are good at what they do, which is accessible morning journalism that informs without being intimidating. But when you book the Chancellor during a period of intense political scrutiny, expectations shift. People want blood. They want the forensic dissection, the uncomfortable silences, the refusal to accept non-answers, and maybe BBC Breakfast just isn't the format for that kind of interview. But let's also talk about Rachel Reeves for a second, because she's in an absolutely brutal position. She's the first female chancellor in British history, which is genuinely historic and should be celebrated, but she's also inherited an economic mess that would make anyone's job nightmarish. She's trying to balance the books while facing pressure from all sides, unions wanting more public sector pay, businesses demanding lower taxes, the public wanting better services, and her own party split on basically everything. The budget she delivered was never going to please anyone, and now every interview is a minefield where she's defending decisions that were probably less about ideology and more about brutal fiscal arithmetic. Those ers and ahs that viewers picked up on, that's not necessarily incompetence. That could just as easily be someone trying to find diplomatic language for, we're completely stuck and every option is terrible. What really gets me about this whole saga is how it perfectly encapsulates modern British politics. You've got a government struggling with messaging, media struggling to find the right tone, and the public that's simultaneously engaged and exhausted. Everyone's got an opinion, everyone's yelling into the void of social media, and nobody's entirely satisfied with anything. The digital ID policy itself, the thing that sparked this whole debate, has basically been forgotten in the fury about interview technique and presentation style. We're arguing about the performance rather than the substance, which is very on brand for where political discourse has ended up. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody really wants to acknowledge. U-turns aren't always bad. Sometimes they're evidence that a government is listening, adapting, responding to legitimate concerns. The problem is when they're so frequent and poorly explained that they look like panic rather than pragmatism. If Labor had come out and said, look, we announced this digital ID policy, we've listened to concerns about civil liberties and implementation challenges, and we're adjusting our approach accordingly. That's actually quite mature governance. Instead, we get this weird gaslighting where they pretend it's not really a change at all, which just makes everyone more cynical. The BBC Breakfast interview has become this perfect microcosm of Labour's first year in power. Lots of sound and fury, accusations flying in all directions, but when you strip it all away, you're left with a government that's struggling to control its narrative and the public that's lost patience with political doublespeak. Whether that's fair or not is almost beside the point. Perception is reality in politics, and right now the perception is that Labour says one thing, does another, and hopes we won't notice. Reeves can insist they're pretty relaxed about policy details all she wants, but the voters watching at home aren't relaxed. They're confused, frustrated, and increasingly skeptical. So what's the takeaway from this beautiful mess? Maybe it's that